Greetings. So I was trying to think of how to introduce David, and mostly what I think when I think about his work is I think about unrevealed stories. And sometimes Western itself is sort of seen as like this little best-kept secret in Oregon, which I think is kind of a strange thing, because it would be better with more attention. But mostly when I think about untold stories, I think a lot about the faculty here and the faculty's various works. And I think the teaching, the students see all the time, but the research, only those lucky people on PRCs or go to certain things that are presented get to really see that. And so it's really a great honor to introduce David Dollinger, and because he's an example of someone who perhaps many people have never really known what he does. But there's some things about David I want to say, and a good beginning point is if you're very aware of his presence at the things he goes to on campus, such as Faculty Senate, he's a person, he's a pretty humble guy, but he also can be very strong, and he definitely will stand up for his principles. Not one to boast, but definitely one to say what he thinks is right. I don't know where the modesty comes from, but the integrity, I think, could be rooted in what he's witnessed and what he bears testimony to in his research. He's seen a lot of things. He's traveled to Eastern Europe while the Soviet Empire was just beginning to crumble. He met and shook hands with John Paul II when he was a beacon for freedom in Eastern Europe. He taught in Czechoslovakia as the Soviet influence diminished, but also as they started to separate. So he's seen a lot. His interest in Eastern Europe's never flagged. It worked. It was essential to his studies when he was at Valparaiso as an undergrad, and was core to his work at the University of Pittsburgh in his graduate studies. His work on Eastern Europe reveals an aspect of it that's largely unrecognized in America, I think. He directly utilizes and incorporates documents on the activities of religious groups in Eastern Europe that many people probably didn't even know exist. And I think his telling of this really unknown story can really powerfully alter how we understand those places and times. David takes us far beyond this image of Ronald Reagan and tear down this wall. He takes us far beyond the notion that somehow we were architects of the new Europe. Europe was built by Europeans, and Eastern Europe the same. This is a contemporary history at its finest. He does direct interviews, and he unearths previously unappreciated writings, and he integrates them into a compelling story about how ideals and communities preserve and ultimately help promote alternative social visions. His exploration of these processes have led him to produce many published scholarly articles and a significant book, Turning Prayers into Protests, Religious-Based Activism and Its Challenge to State Power in Socialist Slovakia and East Germany. As I speak, David's working on a second book and will continue telling stories worth telling. There's one last point I think is worth noting, at least for me personally, I must say, is David to me represents the next generation, next after me. I think there's like 3 after him, okay? But anyway, being of the oldest generation, he represents the next generation here from my generation, and they bring a vision of the profession and of our institution that doesn't look at how far we've come, but instead looks at where we are and what we can be. His cohort also has done something else, is they've generally embraced the Monmouth community and the Monmouth lifestyle far more consistently than my group did. And we're really lucky people to have David and Aaron living locally, and to have their children, Henry and Olive, play and laugh in our hallways. So this is a story that's just being revealed right now, perhaps. Okay, I introduce to you David Dollinger.
Wow, thanks. It's, just in the last 20, 30 minutes, everybody coming into the room and talking to people, this is hitting me in different ways than it did a couple weeks ago when Sue ran into me in the hallway with that letter announcing this award. It's really an honor to be here and to accept this award. And I really like to thank the Pastega family for making this possible. And it was a pleasure meeting you today, Tove, in person. I've seen you at these events many times before. Back when I was a new faculty member, it was always so encouraging to hear Mario Pastega speak about the innovative teaching and research here at WU that he was so proud of. And I know that he and his wife are missed very much on campus. There's a lot of really exciting and interesting research happening here at Western, and I really like to congratulate all the other nominees for this award for their accomplishments and scholarship. It's really exciting always to hear what's happening on campus. I really owe so much to my colleagues in the Social Science Division and the History Department for all their encouragement, their assistance, help in finding resources, trying to make sense of a document that's in Hungarian and in English and with legal implications to it, and really posing great questions in the hallway. We have an amazing hallway. I love our hallway. No matter how rough my day is in the classroom or wherever, whatever is happening in the world, walking down our hallway just, restores. It's so restorative. And so I really appreciate the overall friendship and the solidarity that I'm part of here, not just, in this WU community. And I really like to thank my family. They're all sitting over there at that table I just came from. My parents are here today. And, as parents, they've done all the things that parents do, but, I appreciate it so much. And they've gone above and beyond. When we were away in Germany, I think my dad repaired our toilet at least twice, and they took care of our dog, and a dog had gotten into pills he shouldn't have gotten into, and at so many levels, they're a part of this as well. And Aaron, Henry, and Olive sitting over there as well. In many ways, my research has really become a family enterprise, and I'm grateful for all their help and their assistance. Aaron's just the best partner a guy could have. And her intellectual curiosity is inspiring, and her love has always really put me through, put everything in perspective, and it really kept me sane at times in which I wondered what I was really looking at and trying to make sense of things, or trying to figure out how to approach some issue and trying to make sense of it. And she helped me figure it out. She's the best proofreader in the world, and so many other ways. And Henry and Olive are experts in European history, and I'm not kidding you. Truly. In 2011, I was on sabbatical in Germany through a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and a lot of the archives I was going to were these, federal structures. We had to show a passport to get in, go past the barbed wire, and Henry and Olive could, Henry and Aaron could come to me up to the gate, and I had to say goodbye as I went through the checkpoint to go in, and Henry really wanted to see an archive and be part of it. And he was actually able to help me out in a later archive, one in Leipzig. So let's see if this thing still works. There we go. So I spent months in this little tiny room, and as a graduate student, and it was just exciting to go back to this place with my family. And the archivist there remembered me very well, and was excited to see Henry. So Aaron and Henry got to help me out for a day in the archive. It was great. It was fun. It was really a nice cap to all those months of research. And Olive is learning all about Germany and East Europe and Slovakia and things that happen on campus as she explores the hallway and gets to meet everybody around campus. So I can't wait to take her to Germany, and she'll love those built-in ground level trampolines they have in all the playgrounds in our favorite neighborhoods in Berlin. Henry also recently interviewed somebody who was on a B-24 back during World War II, so he's doing his own oral history research. So the tradition is continuing, and he asked some really great questions. I used the same digital recorder that I use for a lot of my research, so he did a great job. For my presentation today, I was really torn on what direction to go. I really want to talk about the future of things I'm working on, a project I'm working on now. And it's a new book project, and it's about conscientious objectors in East Germany. And I gave a social science symposium presentation the day that I found out about this award. And I found out only after that presentation that I had referred to the audience as in this class several times. And I had no recollection of having done that, and I was so embarrassed. So there will be no pop quiz at the end of this. If I happen to make that slip again, I really apologize if I do that. I'm really going to try not to do that. So what I want to do today, I'm going to move this forward just a little bit, is talk about conscientious objectors in East Germany. And in 1964, East Germany became the only Soviet bloc country during the Cold War to create an alternative to armed military service for conscripts. The decree that created this possibility was issued in September 1964, and it recognized religious belief as a legal basis for a conscientious objector to refuse to be in an armed military unit. In every other Soviet bloc state, conscious objectors faced a lengthy prison sentence if they refused military service. Clergy in the Lutheran Church have been a big part of advocating for this alternative form of service for conscious objectors. The 1964 decree is something I'm really fascinated by in the terms of it. This militaristic, atheistic state creating a way in which somebody could declare for religious reasons a reason to not serve in the military and be able to have legal status. And it's something I'm just fascinated by, and it really created a compromise situation for the men who pursued this form of service. The 1964 decree created a new type of unit. They were called Bausoldaten, construction soldiers, and that's what I've put up here on the screen. They performed maintenance and construction projects for the military. They didn't carry a weapon. They didn't receive any armed training, but they were essentially soldiers within the military. They wore uniforms. They're subject to political indoctrination, as all conscripts were. They served 18 months. It was the same length of service as regular armed soldiers. They received the same pay. The insignia on their uniforms, that was the only distinguishing feature was a little shovel on their shoulders, on their epaulets. And this is a blown up version of that. And those who pursued this option, it really became a black mark on their records for their future career, in terms of educational possibilities, and also the careers and the possibilities for their children as well. And the relatively small numbers of conscious objectors of East Germans overall really pursued this option. In the first year of 1964, there were only about 220 men who pursued this path. By the end of the 60s, it was up to about 400 in a given year. In the 70s, it goes up to about 600-700, depending on the year that you're looking at. The 1980s, it blossoms, it explodes up to 1,000 to 2,000 each year. And even then, it was barely less than 1% of the total number of conscripts. The majority of them were Lutheran, but there were also a large number, or a relatively large number, of Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and a much smaller number of Catholics. In 2001, and actually I was sitting in that room, we brave going backwards with this. Nope, let's go to this one. I was sitting in this room doing some research, reading some documents, actually probably that same binder in there. I went back to look at it again, and the archivist came in and says, "David, I've tracked down that person you're trying to find." And his name was Heinz Becker. He was he'd been a construction soldier in 1979. And I was able to interview him. I traveled to his town, and he was the first construction soldier I was actually able to interview and talk to. And it was this meeting that really transformed how I thought about construction soldiers. I really appreciate what they represented and what they did in East Germany. And he was an amazing guy. I just saw him a few months ago in October, and we really become friends. He and his wife, and I got to meet some of his children previously. And back in 2001, during his visit, he said, "Well, I have everything that I saved back in my, in my garage." And we climbed out, and we climbed through this much debris. I mean, literally climbing over bicycles and old debris to get to a file cabinet he had in the back corner of his garage. And he had saved everything. He created things. He'd really become an activist. And so he let me come back to his home. I came back a week later, and I photocopied everything that I could. He actually happened to have a photocopier in his home. And I went through more than a ream of paper in terms of explaining those resources. And he's moved a lot of those materials to an archive since. In Leipzig, Heinz Becker had joined a group of former construction soldiers who had served in the first two cohorts. So he'd met up with some men who'd done this in the early 60s. And when he met them, he was inspired by the fact that this earlier generation who had done this had continued to meet after their 18 months of service was done. They had met privately in their apartments. They had found ways to really advocate for peace within their communities. And he wanted to do something different with this, would really expand their scope of activity. Leipzig became the epicenter of the revolution in 1989. Things were happening in Leipzig well before the wall came down in November of 89. And it was former Bausoldaten and the group founded by Heinz Becker that was really involved in mobilizing the demonstrations. There were demonstrations totaling 70,000 to 80,000 people gathering in the streets of Leipzig October of '89, a month before the wall actually opened up, and it's connected. And this is that aha moment. Wow, it's these construction soldiers, and the opposition I was studying had all been founded by former construction soldiers. So and nobody had looked at them either. I could just find slight references in secondary sources to them. And that sort of remains the case today. So I've got a little niche here that I'm trying to fully explode. So this book project is focusing on these early generations from 64 to 69, those who served in those first couple of cohorts. And in 2011, when this is my first sabbatical term, when we were in Berlin doing some research, I was going to these federal archives, and I was reading through the East German party and military and state documents. The East Germany no longer exists, so every bit of documentation from this entire government is available now in these archives. And I found a report that it's one of the most interesting documents I found. I want to talk about that report. And it was issued in January of 1965, just a few months after the construction soldier service began. We use the word assessment a lot on campus. We hear it a lot, right? And we all have different reactions when we hear that word. Well, this was the East German Central Committee in the military during their assessment of these first brand new units, and the 220 men who were serving in these units. And the report was addressed to a member of the Central Committee named Erich Honecker. And Erich Honecker became the leader of East Germany in 1971. He was there until '89 when the wall came down. He was kind of forcibly retired as people were streaming across just before the wall opened up. So I want to talk about some things I found in that report. It's really fascinating. And it really describes the lack of preparation, and it's a very frank report, and it describes the lack of preparation that the platoon leaders, the regular Army platoon leaders in charge of the construction soldiers had been given. They had not been fully informed of the nature of pacifism, who these construction soldiers were, what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. That the platoon leaders were not intellectually prepared to be able to handle this group, so to speak, that's within the military. And the result was inconsistent policies in this first cohort between the various units. In contrast, the report talks about the construction soldiers themselves, how organized they are, how coherent, how intellectually critical thinkers they are. During political training sessions, they are posing tough questions that the platoon leaders don't know what to do with. And we see that the construction soldiers are really beginning to challenge many elements of their service. So within the military, we're seeing a space being created for opposition. And this is fascinating to me, how within the Eastern military, something the Eastern military creates becomes a space for challenging. And I've got two quotes from this report that I wanted to share with you. One's fairly long, and I don't like long quotes, but I thought rather than me reading to you, you could look at it as I read it to you as well. So we're still on Henry. Sorry, Henry. Okay. Let's move ahead to this one. So there were 4 stationing points, and one of the big concerns that the construction soldiers had was the issue of pastoral care. What types of services could they have? What could they do? Could pastors come to them? And the platoon leaders really don't know how to address this at all. So there are 4 different stationing points. On one of them, in Prenzlau, and I'll just read this passage. In Prenzlau, for example, the Seventh-day Adventists are allowed to work on Sundays, and on Saturdays they can pursue their religious needs. And then in another stationing point in Stralsund, those in charge don't let this happen. But the construction soldiers ask the question, well, why is it allowed? Why is it possible in Prenzlau? In Gars, the Christians held organized worship services in their quarters based on the church calendar with 3 to 5 hymnals. In Stralsund, the comrades did not let this happen, but they made the mistake and sent 2 construction soldiers to the pastor for Stralsund to ask for Sunday afternoon services to be held for them. And they get away with a lot of this stuff. And this report attributes a lot of this activity by the construction soldiers to Lutheran Church, who've been an advocate for this type of service option. And they attribute this to Lutheran Church, that they're courting in some way, but they don't quite know how. And the report talks about we can't quite figure out what's going on. How are these connections being made? And so the next line I have appears many pages later near the end, kind of in the summary of this assessment. Let's brave this. Okay. And again, I'll read this as we look at it. And these are only 2 larger quotes like this that I have. And so while the commanders and the political deputies of the battalions do not know what is going on in the other battalions, the construction soldiers in Strelitz know exactly what is allowed in Prenzlau and what's prohibited in Gars, and which incidents there were, etc. A key issue that the construction soldiers are presenting to their platoon leaders and that the high command of military is forced to face with is the issue of the oath. Construction soldiers had to take a specially designed oath of service, different from the one that regular soldiers took. And a key issue for this first cohort in 1864 was the language of the oath. And the oath referenced absolute and unconditional obedience to the party state, and a commitment to building socialism, and a commitment to the defeat of enemies. And the language in this is very clear. The construction soldiers argued that they only owed unconditional obedience to God. If you took out the unconditional or absolute obedience, then they'd be willing to take the oath. An entire platoon of construction soldiers refused to take the oath. The Admiral Werner, the admiral in charge of political indoctrination for the entire East German military, comes to this unit, and he's engaged in a debate with them, trying to get them to take the oath. What's wrong with the oath? Why can't you take this oath? And they just flat out refused. And other construction soldiers in other units made similar, almost identical arguments refusing to take the oath. And so within these units, there were these classes for political indoctrination, which yielded also some very interesting discussions, which this assessment reports, only 2 months into service, is already beginning to note these. The construction soldiers were criticizing, critiquing the nature of their service, given its military orientation. After all, they're still supporting the military's infrastructure. They're building an airfield, but they're still building an airfield for the military. One construction soldier argued that a model for a genuine alternative service was the American Peace Corps. I thought of you with that one, John. So they're very aware of what exists in other places with the Peace Corps and other types of non-military type forms of alternative service. Some of them cleverly pointed out how economically inefficient their work was and argued they'd be much more efficient, and that, here's the quote, they could prove their skill and their diligence better if they were transferred to construction projects separate from the military's administrative structure. And the report goes into all the economic inefficiencies of running these construction units. And then the report also notes solidarity amongst the construction soldiers. In one unit, there was an effort to try to create divisions amongst the construction soldiers. And so some cash bonuses were being paid to try to sow divisions and try to kind of buy off some of the support. And so this report talks about what had happened. Again, this is only 2 months into these units. It says bonuses were paid to most of the members of a construction soldier unit. After the bonuses were awarded and the sergeant left the room, the construction soldiers in the unit all pooled their money together and redistributed it equally amongst everybody in the unit. So everybody got an equal amount. So I've got too many documents to deal with. Having full access to the East German military and party state files, I've got piles. But I'm finding just in this one document, I could do so much with it, and I'm really intrigued by this. And so the interviews that Mark mentioned, this past October, I made a return visit to Berlin. And my goal was to really do, with new questions, to really interview as many of the construction soldiers as I could track down. I've got some pretty good networks with, I've gotten to know them really well, many of them really well who have networks, so they were really good at networking. And I was able to do these oral history interviews to try to address some of these questions. And a lot of the construction soldiers I interviewed, they said, well, on our leaves, when we had from date week, we would go to this pastor's house, and we would hang out there, and we could connect with other construction soldiers from other units. And that was somebody who had done this in 1864. When I saw Heinz Becker again this October, he made the exact same reference. And it was the same person. And it took me, those my last 3 days in Germany, I tracked down this. He's now a retired pastor. His name was Peter Mueller. And he had a church geographically located between two of the stationing points. And he opened his home to construction soldiers who are on leave or off duty. If they're too far from home, they could come to his place. And it was a meeting places for wives and girlfriends. They could travel there. He, put them up for a weekend, whatever. He provided that space. Letters and messages could be delivered there without the military going through them. Packages, care packages could be sent there. He stored civilian clothes for them. It was against the law to be out of uniform, but in his home, they could wear civilian clothes, they could drink a cup of tea, and just relax and be normal, outside of the constraints of the East German military. And he provided pastoral care, and he helped them with the theological, moral questions that they were facing in their service. Somebody else I'd interviewed, I've been meeting this person for several years. He served back in 1964. His name was Wolfgang Stadthaus. And I talked to him, I said, well, how were some of these networks formed? Well, how were things so organized early on in these first units? And for him, it was an easy answer. He says, well, he made a lifelong friend on the train platform. There were 2 units in the north, and they were traveling to the north on this common train. All the soldiers, all the construction soldiers that were going to these 2 units. And on the platform, he made a lifelong friend. And on the 3-hour ride north, they worked out an entire strategy. One of them had access to the oath, the text of the oath. They worked out how to respond to the oath. They worked out a plan for communication. They worked out how to respond to the various construction tasks they might be asked to do. And most importantly, the strategy of this would be more than just 18 months of service. That it would be really that they would form ties, networks, and they would continue their service for peace after their 18 months ended, and in their civilian lives. And that's essentially what they did. And that's why I'm so intrigued by them. A key objective after they finished their service was to publicize the construction soldier option to other young men. The East German military did very little to publicize this. They wanted to kind of be there on paper. They could point to it for propaganda reasons, but they didn't really want anybody to really pursue this path. So they really wanted to pass on this opportunity, this possibility. They formed local and regional groups in communities in towns after they finished their service. In 1969, they organized an annual gathering of anybody who'd ever served as a construction soldier or was interested in the construction soldiers. They had an annual gathering where they would all meet in Berlin or in some church in a different location. And they're still active today, and this is why I'm so intrigued by this. 2014, September 2014, will be the 50th anniversary of this decree being introduced. And they've already planned a Congress. It's not just a reunion, but it's a series of workshops. I'm going to be working on how to work within the communities in the 21st century to really advocate for peace in the world today. And so this has really become a lifelong commitment. I'm really intrigued by these. And they're so welcoming and friendly, and I could just talk to them forever. They're thoughtful, humanistic, intellectual people who made a commitment that affected the rest of their lives. And that's something I'm still, I recognize how difficult that is. And I'm trying to understand how difficult that is. Something I never knew from attending these awards ceremonies was that I would get to choose a quote that was meaningful to me. And this was a difficult challenge to do. I had several, and Erin helped me kind of think about some of them, and she nixed the one. I'm kind of glad she helped me nix the one that I was looking at again. Intellectual help there, support. And so let's move forward again. Here we go. It was from Václav Havel. And this is a key figure that really drew me to Eastern Europe. His ideas, his plays. I used to camp out when I was in research in Prague at the castle, and there was a little nook where I'd read Milan Kunder's novels. And I had this idea that maybe Havel would come out and take a walk, late at night, because nobody else was around. But I was there, and the guards were always walking by, so it was a safe place to be, and I missed that. But Havel, in a letter to Alexander Dubček in 1969, talked to Dubček about pressures that were on him to acknowledge and legalize the '68 invasion. And so in a book that Havel wrote in '68, he refers to this. And it's this thing that even a purely moral act that has no hope of any immediate and visible political effect can gradually and indirectly over time gain in political significance. And that's something I really see these men reflecting. My second choice was somebody I've become much more aware of this year. It's the 100th anniversary of his birth. And there's a strong Oregon connection. It's the poet William Stafford. And a couple months ago, Aaron was part of a poetry reading event at the Independence Library in which the poems of William Stafford were being read. And I've become very intrigued by him, and I've read his 1940, Aaron had the pile of books that she was sorting through, and I read his 1947 book. And I found this line. I want to read the full book that this is from. So this may be out of context a little bit. But what he wrote was, keep a journal and don't assume that your work has to accomplish anything worthy. Artists and peacemakers are in it for the long haul, and not to be judged by the immediate results. And I thought this is really reflecting, both of these quotes really reflect something I've come to admire very much through my research. The construction soldiers are always really small in number, and there's nothing small about their consequences and what they did. In hindsight, it's really easy to see that the military strategy completely backfired. They brought a bunch of nonconformists together so they could share home addresses and be in touch with one another. People who felt isolated in this authoritarian state were brought together. And for them, the choice that they made was reflecting, they made this choice with no possibility of any change happening. The wall was there. This is back in the mid-'60s. And it seemed, for many of us, we can remember, I can remember thinking the wall's never going to come down. And it came down, and it's still something I'm still coming to terms with in myself. And so for them, making a choice with no possibility, with very dire consequences for the rest of their personal lives. And so I have up here is an image of an interesting figure who was, his name was Rainer Eppelmann. He was a battle soldat in the second cohort in 1966. He refused to take the oath of service, and he spent 8 months in prison for that refusal. And there's a bizarre element of irony. When the wall came down in '89, it was actually a full year before Germany reunified. So East Germany continued to exist. He was the Minister of Defense in that transition, that caretaker government. And, probably a really good person to have in that position, the Minister of Defense. So I wanted to close with that. So I really, again, thank you for this award, and I really appreciate everybody coming out today. So it meant so much to everybody come in today. And if there's time for questions or comments, I'd really appreciate it. We can talk about this, Ukraine, anything. Let's go. So, but thank you.
Thank you for being here. I would like to thank the Pastega Committee. Thank you. Again, it's such a surprise. I know my colleagues, it's such an honor. It's very humbling because most of my colleagues, they teach just as well as I do. And so to be recognized like this is amazing. So thank you, Tom, and thank you, Henry, and thank you, Maria, and thank you, Julia, and also thank you, Carrie. I haven't met you. Where are you? No, Carrie. Okay. Carrie is a student representative. I'd like to thank David, too. I don't know why I'm thanking you, but David and I started at the same year. Our milestones have been the same. We earned tenure the same year, and we became full professors the same year. And our children are staggered, but a lot of things we've celebrated. And so today is just a big day, too, that we're celebrating the same thing. Okay. I just want to thank my family, too. My mom flew here from Los Angeles, so thank you for being here, Mom. And my daughter, Waverly, who's amazing. Oh, you can't see her, but there she is. My colleagues and friends who are here, just thank you. Heidi, thank you for coming. And the Pastega family, I know, thank you for representing the family. You give us, all of us, you plant aspirations within all of us for each. It's just such an exciting thing to know that this exists and that you value what we do here. So thank you. Okay, so I'll begin. So if you don't understand what I do, I'm a Writing Center professor. I'm a Writing Center director, and I'm an English professor. I straddle two worlds, and it's like having two full-time jobs. But what I do is I work with a range of students. I can't even describe to you the type of students that I work with. But what I do is when I meet a group of students, I ask them, are you a writer? Now, over 90% of students, when I ask that, they're very reluctant to ever say yes. And so the reason they do that is because when I say writer, this is what they're thinking about. They're thinking about major literary figures, or they're thinking about literary or popular genre writers. And I don't mean Time, but I mean Morrison. Or they're thinking about somebody who appeals to all types and ages. They're thinking about wide circulation and money. And so that doesn't fit what they understand writers to be. Or it does fit, I'm sorry. So what they're not thinking about is what is inherent in their college lives as writers. They're doing writing all of the time, but they don't see it as writing. Right now we're bridging social media and academia we're incorporating blogging and of course emails, but we're doing the blogging in the classroom. We're learning to use social media in new ways. Students though are also using it constantly, and it's for personal use, both production and consumption. It is for the other, so they have another audience other than self. But then they're also doing things that the audience itself, and these are things that are functional and transactional. They're therapeutic even, the audience itself. So when you look at this, students are writing all the time, but they are reluctant to say, yes, I'm a writer. So why the reluctance? And this is what I think is fascinating. So in the early 90s, there's someone named Deborah Brandt, and when I read her work, it just was mind-blowing for me. She interviewed individuals, a wide demographic, and what she was looking at was she was exploring the cultural attitudes and the affective circumstances of early memories of literacy experiences. And so part of what she found you won't find surprising. So we read to our kids. It's a family ritual. It's independent of school. They're positive and pleasurable associations. It's encouraged because there seems to be a parental obligation. I mean, my own daughter, people always ask, oh, you've probably been reading to her forever. Yeah, of course I have. We do it together. And so, of course, as our children age, they're finding it pleasurable to read. Even if we don't see them doing it, they're doing it. Now, on the other hand, students don't have the same kind of associations about writing. They're negative, if anything. They're surrounded by punishment, loneliness, secrets, rebellion. Few students actually can recall anything that parallels their reading experiences early on. And when they do start to form memories, it tends to be negative in the school context. And they're unclear even about what a memory should look like with regard to writing. It's so fascinating. And so I say, okay, well, I'm not giving up on you. So let's talk about, do you remember your parents reading? And this takes them a lot of time to think about. They've never thought about it before. And so what they think about is they give it peripheral status. So yeah, I remember seeing my parents do bills, and they do to-do lists, and they do Christmas cards. So what does this say? What does this say then? Okay, so the students that are coming to me, and this is over 90%, and I'm being generous there. 90% of students then who are coming in with a faulty writing foundation. And so if they have early experiences that are negative and non-existent, imagine it gets even more complicated than that. Okay, so on top of that, lore is learned about all these things. And this happens over the course of many years. So they believe that good writing is the product of genetics. So imagine that. You're either born a good writer or you're not. And students believe this. They believe writing is a private affair. It's something you do in private, and you don't show anyone until it's perfect. All right. They think proofreading is intuitive. Okay, this is not true. They conflate mistakes and errors, and there's a big difference there. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But what happens then is we get this lore is then reaffirmed by the responses that we receive from adults and teachers. And so I have to tell my students, did you realize that strong writing is invisible, but weak writing is all we see? So therefore, what are we going to do about this? Okay, so on top of that, taking all of this, negative beliefs regarding capacity for success actually affects basic worth, how you're feeling about yourself overall. And so we have a big job to do. So it means, what's our response as teachers to this? It requires revision, and I think this is really where it begins. In 1976, Mina Shaughnessy wrote Errors and Expectations, and again, it's another text, I read it much later, but it changed my life. She wrote in response to open admission policies in New York, and she created in one of the chapters, it's a developmental scale for teachers of writing. This is, not much has changed, this is what's amazing. Okay, so the first two stages. First is guarding the tower, and so you can guess what that means. It's protecting the academy from outsiders who appear to not belong. They won't make it unless standards are lowered. Now you move up in the scale, converting the natives. You identify that some might catch up. You admit that some are educable, but you approach them as empty vessels. So the whole Freirean, banking concept. So you're going to give them the truth because they're empty. We move then to sounding the depths. Now this is where the teacher stops and says, okay, you know what? The things that I know are simple maybe aren't so simple for my students out there. And so they begin to observe their students and their writing. They observe themselves as both teacher and writing, and they seek a deeper understanding of what behaviors that are associated with writing and the differences that students actually experience. And then you look for patterns and try to see the logic in it. Okay, that's amazing. So there's more? Yes. There's the final stage, and that's diving in. And that's actually the remediation of self as a teacher. According to Shaughnessy, she says that our greatest barrier is our ignorance of our students. But it doesn't have to be that way, but we have to dive in. So, remediation, revision of self, it requires a shifting of perspective and objective. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It means we're going to set aside our expectations and actually meet students where they are. So when I first started teaching, which is 20 years ago, I thought I was really enlightened. I thought, okay, I'm entering the classroom, and I'm sorry I'm not talking to you over here. Okay, I thought I would enter the classroom, and I'm not going to change the writing. I'm going to change the writer. I'm going to make a huge difference in this person's life. And I worked and worked and worked and didn't. This isn't working. It really isn't working for 10 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever I want to do. And so I engaged in quite a bit of research once I got out of my PhD. I finished my doctoral program because I actually realized you could find research pockets in places that matter. And so I started looking around, okay, what's missing here? What is it that we're really supposed to be looking at? And so what I did, partnering with the psychology division, is we started looking at what we're actually doing in, for instance, the Writing Center. And so we're not targeting the writer, we're targeting what's called self-efficacy. And it's writerly self-efficacy. And what that is, it's the individual's belief of being capable of performing necessary behavior to perform writing tasks successfully. So it's not only about how they behave, but it's what they believe about their futures. This is huge. Okay, so if I shift my focus then from actual competence indicators to their perceived competence development, it is a better indicator of their future success than their actual competence. It's just amazing what the effect it has, and studies show that it's their beliefs, it's not their actual competence currently that will determine that. So essentially what this is, it's an internalized construct, and it's learned and developed over time through a synthesis of three things: academic coaching, self-evaluation, and repeated practice. And this is what we do in the Writing Center. You're probably all sitting there going, oh my gosh, that's what we do. So it's possible in 10 weeks for a Writing 135 class or a 230 class or our 440 class, but it's more dramatic in a place like a Writing Center. And I'll explain why later. But we have to shift the way we're seeing what we do. We need to make students who actually have forward-thinking, growth-related, can-do perspectives on future performance in writing. And this changes the decisions they're making now. It changes their objectives, their affect, their endurance, and their perseverance, and that's a big deal. So, to do this, I'm just going to give you a little slice. There's so much you can do, but I figured I'd try to give the things that maybe affect the students that I teach a lot of different students, so I have to separate them out. When we talk about this right now, I'm going to talk about students that enter my 100, 200, 300, and 400 level classes that are not creative writing classes, because that would be a different presentation. So imagine that these classes are filled with some students who are minors and some majors, but there are a lot of students who are coming from your disciplines. They're coming from history and psychology who want the W credit. They want writing intensive credit, so they will sign up for our courses to get that. And so what they are is, I can give you how we can identify them. They don't see themselves as writers. Most of them will wait until their juniors and senior year to take these classes because they're scared. And so they enter, for instance, my 230 class, which is 230W, because they think, oh, awesome, 200 level, it's going to be a breeze. And then, of course, they find it's the absolute opposite. It's very rigorous. But we challenge their fears right up front, and I'm really honest about what we're going to do. They don't see themselves as writers, not English majors. They have challenges they are unable to articulate. And they're oftentimes planning to enter professions where writing is required. This is what's amazing to me. Okay, so based on that, that's my audience when I'm trying to teach them how to undo years and years and years of myths. So the first thing is, this looks familiar, I'm sure. Does this look familiar to you? The process of writing? All right, so you look at understand, assignment, brainstorm, create thesis, research, outline, write, seek feedback, and proofread. So that's really nice, but that's not how we work. It's not a linear process. If you're a writer, and I say writer with a little W, it's not like that. So this is closer. This is what we like to think it looks like. So you see it starts with discovering topic, brainstorming ideas, determining audience, purpose, and gathering data, reviewing, formulating a thesis, drafting, getting feedback, and again, it comes right back around. That's ideal. But that's not how we work either. This is more like what our students work. So imagine, though, these students that I'm describing are waiting until the last minute to do not only my assignments, but yours too. So what happens is, this is really eye-opening for them. You go to, and I have to move over here, I'm so sorry. Discovering topic and brainstorming, and determining audience and purpose, those two things, that's where they begin, and they end there too. They consider that their draft. So what they're doing is they're writing last minute, and everything that's super messy, that part is what they're turning in. And then they also proof, that is their revision, proofreading, and it's oftentimes, they think, intuitive. So they're turning in writing, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, what is this student doing here? Okay, but it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, so with that in mind, we have to talk about the reality of time, because that goes with what I just showed you. I teach students two different ways to think about the way they write, and it's writing to learn versus writing to communicate. So just taking the words in red, learn and communicate. So learn, of course, is to acquire knowledge, and it's to discover meaning. We do this all the time. If you're required to do some kind of writing task, we sit down and we start writing to it. Is it what we turn in? No, it's not. We hope it's not. But our students actually do. If they're doing things last minute, they're remaining right here. They're writing to learn, they're writing through their ideas, they're writing to discover something they don't know yet. So these students also get papers back where their professor writes on the bottom, this was great, I had to get through 5 pages, and here's your point. Why didn't you start right here? Well, because they wrote last minute and they're writing to learn. So in an ideal situation, they should have built-in time, because if they built in time, the idea would be to take that endpoint, put it at the top of a page, put it away for a few days, pull it out again, create a skeleton, and then begin to write to it. And even seek advice from a writing center consultant or from a teacher. But if you're turning this in, so you see where I'm going with this, correct? Okay. Now when we talk about these things, how time is required to move things that way, I get to introduce students to Aristotle, and I do it in a very vague way, but Aristotle, he defines rhetoric as the ability to see in any given situation the available means of persuasion. So when you look at this, and how I tell my students this, is it's the ability to recognize what is most appropriate for my audience. Now, if I take the word appropriate and audience, most students, they've heard the word audience for years, but they don't really get it. But when you can create context where they actually understand what audience is, everything changes because it's always shifting. Even if I'm talking about an email that a student has sent to me, we can talk about audience and how that should shift the way they're speaking or writing to me versus writing to a friend. So with this in mind, we talk about, okay, looking at your audience, where can you go with regard to the product that you're going to turn in? Students who are seeking money through scholarship essays, or they want a job, they will build in the time to move from there to there because they care. So how do we then replicate that in the classroom? Isn't that a good question? Because we see this all the time in the Writing Center. They will come in 15 times for one thing, and they are so excited for the help, and they're excited to revise. So with that in mind, let's talk about notions of revision. Let's say they buy into this, or that it's an urgent situation, and they do want to actually turn in the best piece possible because they want the money. There's the reality of revision. So students oftentimes see revision as this. It's microscopic. We're going to look at sentence level issues. So when you give them 2 weeks to revise, they're like, why do I need 2 weeks? Because that doesn't take 2 weeks. They don't understand revision is so much bigger. So 2 other metaphors that we start talking about is a ship. Ship-like revision is cutting through new waters. It would be, for instance, turning an assignment that completely misses the mark. So let's figure out how can you actually answer the assignment. Something in the middle is the anvil-like revision. I tell students, you have the metal, it's already there. Now it's time to heat it and shape it. You're going to sweat just as much as you do there, but it's a little less. All right, now just to kind of put this in perspective, this is local and this is global. We can learn to talk and see writing in different ways when we think in these terms. Directions and expectations. This is on the global side. So students in my classes, this is amazing to me. Diane's here, and I just went to a 400 level art class, and I do this every year. I go to classes and talk, but I asked, okay, let's talk about summary and analysis. And students can't talk about those things, yet they're asked to do it all the time. And we go round and round, and finally we actually demystify what does it mean to summarize something, and then what does analysis do and how do they work together? And then we can move to synthesis. But here's the thing, if students don't know what terms are, and those terms are the directives for products they need to produce, there's a big problem. So that's a global issue when a student doesn't know that they're not summarizing something. And we can actually get students excited about revising because we've let them in on what we call a secret. They think it's a secret, but it shouldn't be. It should be transparent. We need to demystify all of this for them. Another one is audience expectations. So audience, again, this is new to them. Audience determines size of components in essays. So for instance, I'm going to give just an example to support what I'm talking about. When we write essays, and maybe something that requires summary and response, they will vary in size, those sections, depending on who we're writing for. So if our evaluator, let's say, is a social science person, and this person is asking students to consider Merkley and Ryden and the environmental work that they've done, and who's created more change and why. Okay, so let me think. Who's my audience? Students don't think about this. Okay, well, my audience is person probably that knows a lot about environmental issues and Merkley and Wyden. So therefore, how much summary should go into this essay? Well, probably not much, just enough to support your claim. Now you turn that around, and maybe another social science class or even a psychology class asks you to consider your environmental experiences as a child and explain then how that actually affects who you are today. Who's your audience? It's still the same instructor. Does he or she know anything about your childhood? Absolutely not. So therefore, your summary will be very large, either half or even more than the actual analysis. Students don't think in this manner. And so to demystify the process of even tackling the assignments that you're assigning is a first step. Okay, it would be wrong for me to say that we don't cover grammar. I have to say grammar is the most stigmatizing things that students experience here at Western and probably in the workplace and everywhere in our culture. So one of the things that needs to be done is we distinguish errors and mistakes for students. Now both are deviations in correctness, but one actually has a logic and a pattern to it, and that would be an error. Now students, when we can tell them, we have very competent writers who turn in work with mistakes because they turn it in last minute. That's different. There's no point in even talking about that with regard to in class time. But errors are things that students can't identify, but they're habitual. And so we can actually tend to those things, and students can become in control of it. And so just a few examples. I wanted to actually teach these today, because most people who learn them, they're like, oh, why didn't someone teach me this before? But yes, I figure if you really want to learn this, I'll teach you. Come and see me. But I'll give you just more generally. So we do top comma errors. All right, this is a big deal for students. We do it in context of games, and we explain things. I mean, it's amazing what we can do, how we can build sentences based on their knowledge of comma use without ever using grammatical terms. And we make it repeatable, so it's not luck on their parts. They can actually start manipulating their punctuation use. We can explain the Oxford comma and when it's not used and why. That's a big deal. I mean, to you it might not be, but for them to be in control of what they're doing is a big deal to them. Table talk. This is something that I teach students how a lot of them, their writing, it is the equivalent of going to a pizza parlor. And so imagine going to a pizza parlor and writing like that versus going to President Weiss's house and writing as you would talk there. And I give them characteristics that actually contribute to table talk. And so an example, and I know Provost Jack has mentioned this many times, but it's contractions. Contraction would be one characteristic of something that makes it less formal, your writing. Another is point of view. We tend to write in third-person point of view here. First person is appropriate sometimes. Second person should be never used. And I'm not saying never, but for academic writing, you is completely uncontrolled, and it sounds like we're in the pizza parlor. There's a whole list of things that actually contribute to making students feel their work look informal, and then professors read it and they say, the student doesn't write like a college student. Yet their content is actually amazing. But then they get stigmatized for these types of tiny little pieces that nobody's ever told them. So we do homophone pieces. In-text Quotations, oh my gosh, they don't know when to use them. Like, we can actually tell them when to use them, and they can remember it, and then we can tell them how to actually embed them. They do floating quotations, and we can teach them, well, let's call it a sandwich, and this is what you do. There's 4 steps, and this is what you do. Oh, why didn't someone teach me this? Homophones, there are tricks to homophones, but homophones, you get them wrong, that's like there, and there. You don't get the job. So things like this, we make it accessible and accessible. So we can look at where someone began and where they ended. And again, students always say in class, why now? Why didn't someone teach me this before? So ultimately, it's our obligation as teachers to dive in. But the reality is, we have 1 instructor, 25 students, and 10 weeks. And that's a writing class. So I know there are other classes much bigger. It limits the possibilities of what we can do about student belief. It becomes then the responsibility of the university then to dive in. And a writing center, when it exists, it means the university has done exactly that. So a writing center actually does what a 10-week course cannot. It models, it offers modeling, it does the reflection, it does the practice in a consistent basis, and it's not just months, it's oftentimes years for individuals. It's a one-to-one setting. It's student choice to be there. It's free. We help students in psychology, history, health education. We help scholarship essay, graduate school applications, everything. We have 18 consultants, and they vary in their discipline-specific expertise. We serve over 7,000 sessions a year. We do research to figure out what our students need, for instance, our deaf students, because they have very particular challenges that stigmatize them. Same thing with our bilingual Spanish-English speakers. We offer synchronous tutoring for students who work full-time and have families and can't make it here on time or during our business hours. These are all things that the Writing Center we do every hour, every day, meeting students exactly where they are, and we're serving as an extension then to our classes. So I'm just going to end with an adage. You've heard the adage, it takes a village to raise a child. I have a friend who says that to me quite a bit. And I'd like to just say that it takes a university to cultivate a writer who actually believes that she will succeed. And that's it. Thank you.